Welcome aboard for another edition of Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Well, during our first half hour today, a roundup of several row crop planting considerations, and we've those aplenty to discuss here with our guest live in Mike's side with us now. Ignacio Ciampitti, as you know, is a crop production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and not unlike a number of you producers out there, Ignacio has been chased out of the fields because of the wet weather here locally, so we're glad to have you aboard, Ignacio. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eric, for the invitation.
A number of things we want to get into today, and during our first segment here, focusing mostly on corn planting in Kansas. Now, according to the USDA, some progress has been made. We're up to a third of the crop planted in the state and a little bit behind the average, but it's been a struggle to get rolling, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the last previous weeks, and even by looking at this week, I think that we will be facing a few more challenges in terms of making sure that we get all the corn planted. As you mentioned very well, I mean, USDA came up with a report yesterday showing us that 31% of the corn has been planted. That's a good sign. That's one-third of the crop already on the ground. If you look at progress of planting during this week, I think that we will be a little bit farther behind in terms of, when you're looking at the average, we were already behind. I was not too concerned about being behind for 5 points. If you think about all the conditions that we have in the last weeks, I think that we were in an excellent shape until today. And then this round of rains, I think that will be delaying the progress, when we were looking at the next week.
We're looking at persistent rainfall off and on for as much as 7 to 10 days, perhaps.
Yes, still the thing, at least when we look at the rain monitor, even for today, we are seeing that most of the rain came kind of east. We have some portions of south central, northeast. In some places, believe it or not, the rain was a good thing.
Right.
We were in some situations, really quickly we went from being too wet to really too dry. So for some places, the rain is welcome. If you look on the western side of the state, that we will start rolling more and more now. Southwest, a little bit of rain, not much. And northwest, it will be our place, to start focusing on the next coming days. Similar is north central. So I think that we'll be seeing more progress coming from those sections if we don't get any of the rains that we're expecting to gain in the next coming days.
So, Ignacio, for producers with corn seed still in the bag, waiting for that opportunity, if in fact this forecast holds and there will be multiple delays, one on top of the other, at what point does it become concerning as to getting this crop truly established in a good shape?
I always say, if we want to plant it, the corn seed has a really high price value for the farmers, and I think that we need to make sure that whenever we plant it, we do it in the best conditions possible. And so far, to be completely honest, I'm not too concerned about the planting window. If we're looking at the window that we have, we are investigating even pushing corn planted even in some situations to late May in the areas that we have lower yields. I think that the main concern today are for those guys that they really are pushing for high yields. Those guys that are looking for irrigation or high-yielding corn, those are the guys that they really are pushing corn planted quietly. In fact, we have also some communications with a few farmers, that really already moving into soybeans quickly.
They've already made the switch.
Yeah, because, again, for many of the guys that they really want to get, they are really shooting for that really high yields. And then some of the guys that we were exchanging a few emails and about early planted soybeans, they were looking at 90 bushels, which is, a really high target.
Right.
But if you really want to get there, or if you have a chance to get even close to that number, I would say one of the things that you need to do for sure is early planting. So the early planting concern is more for the high-yielding guys. I would say 70-plus bushels per acre on soybeans and then 250-plus on corn. For the rest of the humans and the mortals, I would say that I think that we have still a nice planting window in corn, and we need to be – my concern many times when we are looking at planting corn is getting too wet getting too early and too cold. If you look at the emergence, it was an interesting data from USDA. When you look at the percentage of planted and emerge, on the emerge, we were only 3%, and we were quite behind from the average. So 14% was the average. And then that gives you something basically to tell you that this spring is becoming quite slow compared with previous spring. And you can even notice, when you just walk around and you see that we have an excellent weather, flowers, blooming. So it's an excellent spring, and it's not being rushed up by high temperatures. So that is showing on the report that the emergence and the growth is becoming quite slow. And I think that is telling us that even if we will plant maybe something in the next week or following weeks, there might be not too much difference between something planting way too early, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, before something planted in maybe first week of May. And I think that is connected to these temperatures. Concerns on cold injury in corn.
That's the other side of the coin. If you had some emergence, was there any damage to those seedlings from our recent run of seasonally cold temperatures?
And to be honest, that is, the timing there is critical, because when we're looking at the cold injury for corn, the first 24, 72 hours are really the ones that are critical. So which means that if a farmer is not looking at the forecast and by random chance is planting, and the next 24, 72 hours are extremely cold, most likely we might see an impact on the seed. And then the main concept is, the way that we discuss the problem is that seed basically that we are planting on the ground needs to absorb water. And it really absorbs 30-40% of the water of the size of the seed. And 50% of that occurs really fast. It occurs basically on the first 1 or 2 hours, during the germination. So the challenge on that is that if the water is too cold because of the temperatures, what will happen is that water will freeze, inside of the seeds, and it will start producing damages to the cell tissues.
The seed itself, not seedlings now.
Exactly. Right. And then we are seeing problems, depending on the stage that the corn is. Of course, if you are in the germination and emergence, that is basically most likely in many situations you might be losing the seed. In some cases, we are seeing deformations. So we are seeing basically what we call the corkscrewing. That mesocotta, is basically, in different shape and form. We are seeing reduction of the metabolic activity of the seed, so the seed is not growing that fast. And then these are the consequences also of, really ununiform emergence. And for corn, believe it or not, the timing of emergence and the not only the uniformity between plants that you want to really capture the most uniform stand possible, but the timing, making sure that those plants are coming, everything at the same time is critical if you want to set for really high yields. I think that the stand quality is one of my main concerns when we're looking at corn right now. I have seen some planters, some guys pushing too wet, and I think that we will be penalized in the next coming weeks by looking at lack of uniform stands, plants that they are not looking the same, compaction problems, and those plants that they are not really well established in the field.
If producers see any or all of those signs of issues with that seed, chilling injury, do they seriously need to think about the yield potential, of course, but whether or not they want to stay with that stand or go another direction?
Yeah, and I would say, I think that your question goes to the direction of replanting,
right?
Without mentioning, right? If you think about replanting more in this economic environment, I think that we are thinking several times before we decide on replanting. I would say to producers, that they are shooting for very low seeding rates. Those are the ones that should be more concerned, because in those cases, every time that you are losing one seed, you are losing one plant, and then you are behind from getting to the optimal number of plants so you can optimize the yield for your environment. For those guys that are shooting for a little bit more, which is the target, and they probably already know that, so those guys that are losing maybe a few plants, doing planting, and maybe considering that the conditions are not optimal, in those situations, I think that we will be fine. And I'm always thinking about that. In order to start thinking about replanting, you need to have a very poor stand, and you need to lose, more than 30 or 40% of the stand. And because, based on the economic prices, it's really hard to think about replanting on these conditions.
Yeah. At the minimum, producers need to be monitoring what's going on out there. Clearly,
for sure.
Ignacio.
For sure.
Very good. Well, we'll come back after the break and we'll talk about soybeans and some of the issues that may be presented as we approach the bulk of planting in the state. There has been some soybean acreage sown, but we're just getting going with that crop. If you'd stand by, Ignacio, we'll dive into those subjects. Our guest on this part of agriculture today, Ignacio Ciampitti, Crop Production Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with him and with more after you hear this over the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back to our Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. And in the guest chair once again is Ignacio Ciampitti, Crop Production Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We're kicking around several things regarding corn and soybean planting and the complications brought on, again, by the weather. And let's turn to soybeans now, Ignacio, and we'll talk planting dates. Producers in recent years, you've noted in a recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter article on soybean planting, have been gravitating more and more toward earlier planting dates, right?
Yeah, and it's impressive. In fact, if you look at that information that we put together, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, it looks like, the rate of planting, and we are planting earlier, since, almost, in some situations, 2 weeks already compared with the 1980s, which makes sense. In fact, I have been discussing during the winter with many farmers, and we have many of our farmers out there that they are planting today before soybeans and corn. Just by looking at, seeing if they can anticipate soybean planted, and then they're having good basically outcomes when they look at planting soybean first in some situations. In many cases, my concern, as similar to corn, is are we leaving the seed too early on the ground, and then how many days total when you look at the entire number of days that seed is just sitting there without doing much.
Is it vulnerable to seedling diseases, for instance? Diseases,
insects. So, if you plant early, make sure that you use seed treatments. That's one of the rule of thumb. Don't blame seed treatments if they don't last what you would like or expect to last, maybe more than 20 days, if the seed were not coming up. So, but the trend is clearly going into, farmers pushing that envelope and trying to plant as early as possible. We have this recommendation that for sure we are updating currently right now on looking at planting dates, and few comments that we discussed with a few farmers when they look at this information that we divide by zones. They are like, well, good luck to try to get high yields with this recommendation. And I'm always saying the recommendation that we propose on the different zones, like if you're going to Northwest, planting in between May 10 and June. If you are going to, Southeast, you know that you are planting most of the times between mid-May and mid-June. Most of these recommendations are just general rules. That doesn't apply to all farmers. And then for those guys that they are really adventurous and they're pushing really the envelope and they want to get extremely high yields, again, the concept is when you're pushing for those high yields, early planting is one of the factors. Increasing the duration of the growing season. Increasing the duration of the growing season comes in many situations by planting a little bit early, or by hopefully having a good fall. A nice fall that basically will increase the size of our growing season. So,
relate all of that though to the maturity group that one selects to plant. according to that planting date, making those align. And these are pretty standard guidelines over the years. Are there any changes to those?
Not, to be honest, not much. I mean, what we start finding more and more often is that the rules don't usually apply all the time. So what I'm saying is we have a standard, if you look at the information that we provided, is that if we are close to the north central, border to Nebraska or northwest, usually we are looking at group 2s, okay, or late 2s. And then if you are just going south, you start looking at group 3s. And then when you are going to the southeast, south central group, we were looking to move into group 4s. And then in southeast, some guys are pushing also group 5s and longer. But when you look at the information that we collected in the last couple of years, I will tell you that rule doesn't apply all the times. So when you're looking about selection of maturity groups, I think that farmers, they need to look at different things. The weather patterns, connected to specific situations, like if it's at dry land versus irrigation. And the irrigation, you want to maximize, the duration of the growing season, so you will push for longer maturity. In dryland situations, or late planted, you might be looking at shorter, maturity. And similar to what we discussed before, when we are planting too early, our recommendations are make sure that you treat the seeds, fungicide, insecticide. If you are in situations that we know that we might have issues on cyst nematode, select some of these varieties that will do very well on nematode. And then if we are looking at planting, as we discussed in corn, I usually feel safe when I'm looking about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, on 2-inch soil depth. If you are planting in soils that they have, lower temperature, or even farmers are looking at forecast, cold fronts are coming. So I think that we need to consider this information and make the decision. So if we are putting the seed there on the ground with less than 60 degrees, that we know that seed will take more time to emerge, and we might have poor vigor at the end of the day. So, and then those are the conditions that we need to start thinking about, when we are taking decisions on planting date and maturity group selections.
Ignacio, you've been involved with work here at Kansas State University of late, and this has been going on for some years, on row spacing for soybeans and the effect on yield, looking at narrow rows versus conventional rows and tying all of those loose ends together. And you say this largely depends on, which makes perfect sense, the yield potential of that given field.
Yeah, and also depends, as I always explain, even to when we discuss with farmers, on what is the main limiting factor in your field. If your factor limiting to get high yields is water and it's not the light, then your issue is not the row spacing, most likely. If your factor is that you are pushing to really get high yields and you really are constrained by when you can plant and how many days total you have, then potentially your issue could be, and one of the things to facilitate this problem is to narrow rows. This is from the concept of improving yields. Now we can also discuss the concept of, narrow rows introducing this benefit to the environment of, weed control. And I think that's a very relevant concept when we discuss today about weed control and the problem that is, for our farmers, this, I would say, probably I will confess, it's a number one issue, okay? Right. So thinking about strategies on how you can become more efficient rather than rely all the time, not only on herbicides. For those guys that they do the pre and the post, excellent. But what is next? What are the other things that you can do in order to make sure that you look at the system? I think that the idea of looking at having good residue cover before planting your crop. It could be by cover crops or by just having a good residue coverage. Having the narrow rows also give you the benefit that when you look at the field with a 15-inch row spacing, that field will basically close the canopy faster. So most likely when you're looking in August or mid-August, you go to that field and you might not see the soil. That helps because basically that doesn't leave any space for any late coming weeds. that it can be a pain when you're looking at controlling those, at harvest. 30-inch, the issue is that most likely sometimes, based on the growing conditions, you might still see that canopy open until, in many situations, even until seed filling. So that opens up the possibility that many weeds will come, even the late-coming ones. They will come late, and then you will need to come back and then start looking at strategies to control that weed. For the yield improvement, going back to the yield improvement side, I think that we did several studies working with on-farm research. We continue working with farmers to test these practices, and then we are seeing usually small advantages on the yield. Usually it could go from 2 bushels to 5 bushels, but the advantages are there. And I will always say, in my conclusion when we discuss on row spacing to farmers is, look not only to the yield improvement, but also try to put some value onto controlling those weeds and being more efficient on doing that control.
And there are a number of other factors to consider here. But when you think about narrow row spacings very briefly, you have to study that carefully and understand what your field is capable of.
Yeah, and I'm also, very understanding on the equipment needs and the equipment availability that the farmers have, and trying to work with those farmers to see if there is a truly need to move into the 15 inches, and then to see what is the real benefit, and to make sure that we put expectations on the right place. If they are looking for, a huge bump on yield, this is not the practice. This practice can help you to add more and become more efficient in controlling weeds.
Well, Ignacio, our time is running short here, and there's much more that we could get into as far as seeding rates for soybeans et al. But you continue to churn out information on corn and soybean crop establishment in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series out of K-State, and you'd advise producers to keep tabs on what you're putting out there, for you're writing more as we speak, correct?
Yes, more information is coming for sure.
Very good. We appreciate you being along with us today. Many thanks, and hopefully the weather will break and you can return to the fields very soon to get those test plots established here in the not-too-distant future.
Yeah,
glad to have you by. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation, and also good luck to all our farmers with the planting season.
Indeed. Ignacio Ciampitti has been our guest on this first half of Agriculture Today. He is a crop production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, as you know. Now this break, after which we'll return with today's agricultural news headlines, this week's edition of Milk Lines, and more for you still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. For the USDA's Crop Progress and Condition Report for Kansas this week, as of this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies were at 8% surplus, 77% adequate, 15% short to very short, and subsoil moisture 10% surplus, 83% adequate, and 7% short to very short. Soybean planting, as we talked of with Ignacio Ciampitti earlier, 2% done. The 5-year average is right at that. Winter wheat crop condition in the state, 11% poor to very poor, 31% fair, but 58% called good to excellent. Winter wheat jointing in the state, 64%. That's behind the 75% average for the date. And winter wheat headed at 4%. That's way behind the average of 22% for the date. And again, corn planting, 31% done. The average is 36%. Emergence at 3%. That is considerably behind the 14% average on emergence for this date. For a glance at corn and soybean planting progress nationally now, return to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says there were only a few good days for field work in the week ending April 28th.
We're still running far, far behind the average pace for most major crops.
First, he pointed to corn.
We see 15% of the intended 2019 corn acreage planted by April 28th. That is significantly behind the 5-year average of 27%, but right on par with what we saw last year, which was also a slow planting season.
He said progress is dramatically behind in Illinois, Minnesota, and South Dakota.
Corn emergence lagging due to late planting and cool and wet soils.
He adds that soybean planting progress is also behind schedule.
Nationally, we see just 3% of the intended soybean acreage planted by April 28th. That's half the average pace of 6%.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the national condition of the winter wheat crop, 64%. Good to excellent, 28% fair, and 8% poor to very poor, according to the USDA. By the way, the Wheat Quality Council's 2019 Hard Red Winter Wheat Tour departed Manhattan early this morning, on their way now through northern and central Kansas to arrive at Colby later on this evening. Tomorrow on the broadcast, we'll have our first report from the tour, courtesy of K-State Wheat Production Specialist Ramalo Lulato, right at this time, so be listening for that. Japan will not be able to concede on ag trade issues before the July Japanese elections. That according to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He told this to President Trump last Friday, according to the Financial Times. U.S. Ambassador to Japan William Haggerty told that newspaper that the president was very clear in reminding the Prime Minister that his goal is to achieve a more reciprocal relationship with Japan. The president urged Abe to reduce tariffs on U.S. farm goods, again signaling he could levy tariffs on the 1.7 million cars that Japan sends annually to the U.S. as negotiating leverage. The president said that Japan puts very massive tariffs on our agriculture, but added that, quoting here, "We do not tariff their cars, so I think this is something we will work out." Abe pointed out that Japan accounts for tens of billions of dollars of investment in the U.S., along with tens of thousands of jobs created by their investment. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines, and standing by with that, K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the control of insects in your alfalfa fields. As we approach spring and early summer, thunderstorms start to arrive from the south. Very likely they're bringing some insects with them as well. Those insects are likely to settle into your alfalfa fields. We also probably have some that hatch from eggs that are left in the fields from last year, and those are probably starting to chew at our alfalfa crop across the state. So, if you're not scouting your alfalfa fields regularly, have you hired somebody to do that? Sometimes that's the best way to get things done in the spring. You know, we've got a lot of other things on our minds, including corn planting and taking care of the dairy cows, so maybe we should turn that over to a professional who can do it on a regular basis for us. Might be a cheap investment, actually, as you look at the grand scheme of things that you need to accomplish on your dairy every day. How often should these fields be scouted? Well, at least weekly, and as we start to see more insects in the field and start to find a few, we probably need to do it 2 or 3 times a week. Now, some decisions that you have to make as you look at your various methods of control of insects. Basically, we really have 2 things that we can do. We can either harvest the alfalfa, take away the food source, and then the insects will most likely disappear from the fields, or use insecticides to treat the field to kill the insects. However, keep in mind that when we use these insecticides, we're killing the good guys as well as the bad guys. Yes, there are insects out in your field that are trying to help control the bad pests that are attacking your alfalfa. And when we use insecticides, we're going to take everything out. So when we kill all the insects, then we need to probably continue with those applications of insecticide maybe throughout the growing season as we start to see populations increase. So how soon can you take that first cutting of alfalfa? Well, you could take it as early as bud stage if you have an insect population that's starting to cause damage to the crop. How do you know it's causing damage to the crop? Well, I can tell you from experience, if you're starting to notice damage in your alfalfa fields from the pickup window, you're about 2 weeks late in trying to do something about it. So, again, scouting on a regular basis, either yourself or a professional that comes out and does that for you is a very important thing to do. And most of the time we talk about economic thresholds. So do you need to do something when the first insect appears? Well, no, not when the first insect appears, but when you start to see 1 or 2 larvae per stem, it's probably time to do something, either cutting or an insecticide treatment. If you choose insecticide treatment, keep in mind that there's also a delay in harvest due to the fact that you've treated the field. In other words, you have to wait a certain number of days before you actually cut the field for hay or haylage after you've treated it. So you need to observe those label directions when it comes to holding off on cutting after application. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to get out and evaluate their alfalfa fields for insect damage and make a decision whether or not it's time to cut or is it time to apply insecticide.
All right, Mike, many thanks. Remember, you can take this program in via podcast. To subscribe to that service, go to agtoday.net. That's agtoday.net. This is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today and to our weekly segment on wildlife management. Joining us once more is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, you bring information this week on 2 snake species, one you say on the incline, the other on the decline. This is about copperheads and king snakes, both of which we've found in Kansas, of course.
We've got 3 different species of king snakes in Kansas. We have the prairie king snake, feeds on small mammals, snakes, lizards, birds, and bird eggs. One study showed about 60% of their diet was solely prairie voles. They're one of the first snakes that's active in the spring and very, very common. We also have the western-eastern complex of king snakes. The purely eastern king snake would be found primarily just in the extreme southeast part of Kansas, and the western complex would be scattered in lesser numbers the further west you go. And then we have the speckled king snake, yellow and black in coloration, probably preys more on snakes and other reptiles than the other 2 species, maybe the least abundant out on the high plains. So those 3 species of snakes are all constrictors, and there's been additional research that shows when snakes are killing by constriction, they're not suffocating their prey. Typically, it's shutting off the blood circulation to the brain. The animal then passes out from lack of blood flow, and that happens fairly quickly. So it's not a long, drawn-out process when a constrictor kills their prey, and then the animal begins feeding almost immediately. So with that kind of as a background for the predators, since all of those king snakes would prey on other snakes, we look at the prey. There's been a considerable amount of work done on snake ecology, particularly in the southeastern United States, looking at the difference in snake growth and reproduction and survival. They've also done some work looking at population-level responses in regards to predator-prey relationships. And the prey in this case would be copperheads.
And something that folks might not have realized, that we have this predatory relationship between the 2.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that know king snakes would oftentimes kill other snakes, but probably not a lot that's known that perhaps they kill enough to impact population numbers. So what was done here, looking at some data from some national forest areas in southeast United States, one in Alabama, that the eastern king snake was one of the most commonly encountered snakes within that national forest. 30 years later, that species was considered extirpated, and at the same time, the copperhead snakes changed from being infrequently observed to being the most commonly encountered species on that particular national forest. So they suspected that the copperhead populations resulted from a release in predation pressure caused by the absence of king snakes. They do admit that habitat change over time has not really been evaluated, and it should be evaluated to get a true cause and effect relationship going. So they decided it warranted an additional look to try to make some determinations of whether this is a true predator-prey relationship that's causing significant ecological change or not. And so they gathered data from other existing snake studies where data was gathered from long-term monitoring projects when the folks had looked at the number of king snakes and copperheads that were captured in each cover type by each type of trap over a given length of time. Actually, it looked at quite a large number, as much as 370 sites that had long-term data available, and then just tried to do a correlation to see what was the impact.
And did they, in fact, confirm this relationship?
Yeah, they had a very clear conclusion that there was a negative relationship between the relative abundance of king snakes and the relative abundance of copperheads. And that's consistent with their hypothesis. And they think that copperheads benefit in times when we have low populations of king snakes. The question becomes, if we're trying to manage reptile populations, which species do you manage for? Do you manage for a species that would be the predator, or do you manage for the species that would be the prey? Perhaps even more importantly would be, what would be the relationship between the decline in the number of king snakes, and can we do something about that? Is that something that's maybe human-caused, or is that also an ecological concern that humans have not played a significant role in?
So that brings to mind the question, can both be managed for mutual benefit?
Well, I think they're vastly different species. Their habitats are quite different. They're found somewhat in the same type of locales, but their food habits are somewhat different. We know that copperheads are a venomous species, and consequently there are some risk associated with people being in close proximity to copperheads. But at the same time, they're a species that we've coexisted with for many, many years. When we look at people that are bitten by snakes, copperheads certainly bite quite a few people, but fatalities are a fairly low number. But just because a species has the capability of causing a human mortality, does that mean that we manage against that particular species? I think most ecologists would argue that no, both snake species have a role in our environment. We probably ought to do a better job of figuring out what that role is and promoting that role rather than trying to manage one species over the other.
One last thought that you say should be considered, though, and you brought up habitat, that needs to be examined more closely in as far as how that relates to the relative growth and decline of these populations.
Yeah, I think that's something that's certainly missing in this particular research report. See what habitat changes are important when they're looking at these long-term monitoring plots.
Well, it's an interesting interaction in the wild between two types of snakes, the king snake and the copperhead, and this recent survey has confirmed some things about what is happening with those two respective species. Charlie, thanks for the look at this. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. That's our Tuesday edition. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.